This man cannot remain in power.
But then the White House walked it back, saying, well, Biden didn't actually mean to call for regime change. And the views were decidedly mixed for his NATO meeting on Ukraine held in Brussels.
The talk has to be tougher. NATO and the U.S. have to be more aggressive.
Now we're veering into war, and Biden's back in Europe. The president cares more about uniting NATO than uniting America.
I think the impulse, the emotional impulse, is to say, do something. Is President Biden doing enough to communicate the
This was that sort of Mr. Gorbachev take down that wall Reagan moment when he said this yesterday, and then suddenly it's, oh, wait a minute, clean up on aisle 6, as I saw one pundit say on Twitter. And you look at the situation, you had President Biden saying that, yes, he is a war criminal, and then that's walked back. Larry Kudlow on Fox Business wrote an op-ed for FBN, foxbusiness.com, and said the exact same thing. People are in agreement about this. And as far as let's remove him, Biden did not say that. He said he can't be the ruler. He's got to go. The two, meaning removal or he can't be the president, he's got to go, are not mutually exclusive. Both can be true. We're not saying remove. At least I didn't interpret the president as saying we need to remove.
But I think it was at least implied. The president's words matter, and this was a very damaging ad lib. Molly? You have this clash, and I think every journalist feels it, between the absolutely heart-rending scenes that we see on our screens day after day, civilians targeted for death, nearly 4 million refugees, at least 300 killed in that bombing of the theater, about half the children in Ukraine have been displaced. But then there's a concern, understandably, about a direct U.S. confrontation with Russia, whether that would lead to a nuclear war. And you said a moment ago, the press loves the escalating kind of talk.
You know, these images are horrific. We're seeing a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. But you look at some of these press inquiries of Jen Psaki, and almost all of the questions are focused on why aren't we doing more to intervene? Why aren't we doing more to escalate? You'll get very occasionally one reporter saying, what are we doing to end this? And it seems that, you know, the American people definitely want this to end, but we need to have much more of a discussion about whether regime change should be our de facto policy. And it's clearly, you know, with the exception of the previous administration, it's kind of clear that has been the policy. That's why Ukraine is such a player in U.S. policy, because many administrations have sought to do regime change. We don't have a particularly great track record with regime change, even when we're not dealing with really powerful nuclear countries like Russia. And so we need to see much more debate about this as opposed to just encouragement toward a more escalatory issue.
That's a fair point. Liz, in an AP poll, 56% of those questioned, including 43% of Democrats, say President Biden isn't being tough enough in response to the Russian invasion. But of course, there will be consequences to getting tougher. And people say lots of things that they want in polls that may not be realistic.
Yeah, and you saw the Reuters Ipsos poll where they said we've got to do more, and yet they don't want to be involved. We do not want to see a war involving NATO and, of course, Russia. But I mean, that you can't have it both ways. The United States, shortly after, I believe it was hours after Mr. Zelensky had spoken to Congress, committed 800 Stingers, 7,000 machine guns and small weapons. We have sent what, of course, we know as the Patriot missile anti-missile defense system. We've spent a lot of money here. We are doing a lot, but then you do hear, for example, John Barrasso, the Republican, he's a doctor in Congress, of course. He just came out, on Fox News and said, we got to send the MiGs. You put MiGs in there, and this is something that I believe Molly's right. You've got to talk about how do we end this. You kind of provide those, and you may have a full-blown hot war between NATO and, of course, Russia.
Yeah, I don't understand these arbitrary bureaucratic distinctions that Javelin missiles are okay, but Polish MiGs are not. And, as if we have a lot of time here. Ukraine may not have that much time. And Molly, there's a media debate, especially on the right. There was a recent article in the Federalist saying there's an organized effort to promote direct U.S. involvement in the war. Are these traditional neo-conservatives? Is it broader than that? And do you think it's succeeding?
Well, there has been sort of a bipartisan, if failed, foreign policy consensus that has dominated Washington for decades. And it is clear that they're pushing, again, escalation. I just saw that Emmanuel Macron was cautioning people to not escalate so much. There are different ways to resolve conflicts, and we should be a leader on that stage. We should be pushing, we should be gathering the people together in our leadership position to end this situation. And there has been, just again, a bad track record, and it is from both parties. But the last administration that moved away from this failed foreign policy consensus was a Republican administration, the Trump administration. And what we saw with that was a great deal of peace breaking out all over the world, and we saw a period of renewed strength for America as opposed to what we're experiencing now.
But why do you think that, Molly, that the press or elements of the press are pushing for, why aren't you doing this, and why aren't you doing this, and why aren't you doing more? Are they trying to make news, or is there some sort of sentiment among not just pundits but journalists that we're really tired of these atrocities and we feel like U.S. has some obligation to escalate?
Well, everyone hates these atrocities. Everyone thinks that Russia is wrong to have done this with Ukraine. These are very complicated situations, and you do want to end that rather than expand it. Getting more involvement, like everything that we're seeing about getting much more equipment over there is directed toward having sort of a proxy war with Russia. That's dangerous, and we need to have people who are cautioning about that and having that debate as well.
Liz, huge headlines when the State Department officially said Russia is committing war crimes. Is the coverage of that overplayed in the sense that nobody's arresting Vladimir Putin and dragging him to stand trial in The Hague? And is it inadvertently, perhaps, fueling public support for more aggressive U.S. action?
Well, Howie, as you said, words do matter, of course, but I think that the press is getting a little too precious about actual semantics and wording here. We have a slaughter going on in Ukraine, and the images are absolutely horrific. It has united NATO, absolutely, but I would argue it is Ukrainian President Zelensky and his words and the way he has tailored and actually, customized his speeches depending on his audience to unify NATO. And yet, do you really want to go in there? And there is a difference, Howie, when you're talking about fighter jets going in and versus defense systems. Those are two very different things. And I think all of NATO wants to remain extraordinarily cautious.
Well, since you brought that up ahead, we'll talk to President Zelensky's former press secretary about the view from Ukraine. But when we come back, a media uproar over text from Ginny Thomas, wife of the Supreme Court Justice, trying to overturn the election. Court Justice Clarence Thomas sent after the election to Mark Meadows, then the White House Chief of Staff. Some of her texts involve wild theories. Watermark ballots in over 12 states have been part of a huge Trump and military white hat sting operation. And Biden crime family and ballot fraud co-conspirators, elected officials, bureaucrats, social media censorship mongers, fake stream media reporters, etc., are being arrested and detained for ballot fraud right now and over coming days, and will be living in barges off Gitmo to face military tribunals for sedition. Molly, Ginny Thomas obviously has a career separate from her husband, but there's been a media uproar since Bob Woodward and Robert Cox disclosed these texts, because you do have the wife of a Supreme Court Justice talking to the Trump White House about overturning the election and passing on some false information about all these people who are going to be facing military tribunals, are going to be held on barges at Gitmo. Your take?
Well, it's certainly newsworthy that these messages were released by a political committee at the House to reporters, and it's worthy of being covered. But it is a little weird how it's being covered, particularly because everyone's saying that this means that Justice Thomas has to recuse himself from any cases involving anything about election issues. That's ludicrous. I mean, first off, it is okay, it is legal to have concerns about the 2020 election and how it was conducted. I literally wrote the book on all of the problems with that election, which were very serious and systematic and worthy of being covered and discussed. As for Justice Thomas, there is a standard for recusal, and one that isn't even anywhere near an issue where he would need to recuse. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a husband who was active in the law, and his law firm was constantly having cases before the court. She once signed an opinion and donated it to a pro-abortion fundraiser where that group was actually having a case before the court. She herself opined on whether Trump's taxes were an issue before she heard a case on that, and nobody called for her recusal. And they're actually dealing with the justice herself. And so this seems to me to be just yet again, a political attempt to take down Justice Thomas, which has been going on for 30 years.
Well, it is up to Justice Thomas and he alone to decide whether to recuse. Certainly liberal pundits, Liz, are calling for that, and he has heard a couple of January 6th related cases. But Ginny Thomas, let's take it separately. She had a lot of access to the Trump White House and the president. So how big is it as a news story that she's offering some QAnon theories and saying this is a coup and saying save us from the left taking America down?
It's not a nothing story. I would definitely say that. It is important to note here, Ginny Thomas is absolutely entitled to say whatever she wants, and just because she is the wife of a Supreme Court justice does not mean that she has to be quiet and not say those things. I certainly would say that even as you have some conservatives saying even that and what she said appears to be seditious, doesn't matter. She's allowed to say it. I think it becomes an issue, and you don't have to be
I'm just saying, wow, we're going to keep covering this.
A law professor to understand that ethically, judicial scholars would simply say that this does not look good, especially when Justice Thomas became the one lone dissenter on the very issue about President Trump, who did not want those communications released that had something to do with Justice Thomas's wife. I know it gets a little confusing here, but when he becomes the lone dissenter, that does not necessarily have
Justice Thomas is one of the most principled justices we've had in our history. He always is consistent in what he says. We've had previous issues. We've had previous issues with liberal justices having spouses who are activists, and we call that a marriage penalty if they're forced to recuse. So we need to have that context too.
All right, fair enough. There was a leak to the New York Times of a letter by a prosecutor who quit the Manhattan DA's office after his boss refused to approve an indictment of Donald Trump in that fraud investigation. Mark Pomerantz wrote that Trump is guilty of numerous felony violations, is a grave failure of justice. Molly, excuse me, aren't prosecutors supposed to bring charges or keep their mouth shut?
Yeah, that used to be the standard. We would have nothing said unless actual charges were filed. That standard has been thrown out the window. We noticed that with the Russia collusion hoax, where things would be leaked that weren't indictable, even the Mueller report itself. But I think, he did what he did knowing the media would cover it. The media need to also be careful to not just be played by these people.
And on that point, Liz, there was a new DA, Alvin Bragg, who was elected in Manhattan, and he doesn't think there's enough evidence for a criminal case. This guy Pomerantz had to know if he put this declaring Trump guilty in a resignation letter, it would leak, whether he had anything to do with the leak or not. Wouldn't there be an absolute avalanche of media criticism of this if it were aimed at any other politician other than Donald Trump?
Absolutely. Pomerantz is wrong here. Prosecutors step down when they don't agree with their superiors. That does happen, not all the time, but when it does happen, that prosecutor who stepped down had access to all kinds of information. He or she should not be out there spewing opinions, especially because in this country, you are innocent until proven guilty. This was a mess. And in fact, if he does truly believe that Donald Trump was guilty of these things, he's just hurt the cause for any future litigation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's absolutely unacceptable for a prosecutor to do this. You make your case internally, and if you're not the boss, you have to go along with the verdict. You can't just smear somebody because you don't like them, even if you are convinced that they did something questionable. And whether there is evidence that Trump, in fact, did overinflate his real estate assets or not, at this point, we don't know. Molly Hemingway, Liz Klayman, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday. Up next, the former Zelensky press secretary on the devastation in her country and whether the Biden administration is doing enough to help. Mandel, Washington Post, and CBS of Volodymyr Zelensky's press secretary for 2 years until last summer. I spoke to her earlier from Ukraine. Yulia Mandel, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Talk about the humanitarian crisis and whether the Biden administration is doing enough. While Ukraine is pleading for more defensive weapons from the U.S. and NATO.
Let me quickly. Criminal who had previously been convicted of trafficking cocaine. In 2017, he was running a drug business in a house where his children lived. Judge, do you remember a man named Keith Young?
All right, this is Judge Jackson, who is Joe Biden's, let's see here, who is, this is Joe Biden's nominee pick for a lifetime position for Supreme Court. And so we're just gonna check out some, a few visuals of what's taking place inside of the nomination process in the U.S. Senate. It's been very tough. It's been aggressive. There's been a lot of concern raised around some footage on it, but it's very interesting. And so we'll just check it out for what it is. Make sure you go to MSTA13. Go.
And was found with 2 1-kilogram bricks of heroin worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, along with a gun, ammunition, thousands of dollars in cash, and equipment to cut and package heroin for retail sale. The drug lab also confirmed that there was fentanyl in both bricks of heroin. Calling his wife and brother to give them instructions on collecting drug money from people for him. The prosecutors filed a notice of Young's criminal history, which meant he faced a mandatory minimum of 20 years. You did not seem to like that, Judge. In fact, at his sentencing, you said, this is a quote, that you shared his frustration, that you couldn't give him a lighter sentence. I was shocked to see this in the transcript. I was also shocked that you apologized to this drug kingpin for having to follow the law. You literally said that you didn't think 20 years is fair. This is the quote. And for this, I am sorry. Mostly because I believe in second chances. You apologized to this career criminal, a drug kingpin. In his own words, he was not some low-level first-time drug offender who made a bad choice. That was in 2018. But in 2020, you got a second chance. After Young's sentence, Congress passed something called the First Step Act, which reduced sentences for serious drug traffickers with lengthy criminal records. During the pandemic, lots of criminals like Keith Young tried to twist the First Step Act's compassionate release provision, which was intended for terminally ill elderly inmates to get early release and blame it on COVID. You had none of that, and that's good. You rightly said at his resentencing hearing, quote, COVID-19 is not only present in prisons, and you said that Young's past as a smoker and his claim of various other health issues did not entitle him to early release. If you stopped there, I would have cited that as a great example of how you follow the law and made a well-reasoned decision. Unfortunately, you didn't stop there. You said in the resentencing that, quote, Congress did not make their changes under the First Step Act retroactive. That if they had, then you could have given him a reduced sentence. But then you said, no matter what the law says, and this is a quote, Judge, the court feels as though in this moment, per Mr. Young's compassionate release motion, the court is being called upon to evaluate the length of his sentence under the revised section of the law in the First Step Act. And so it is almost as if I am sentencing him today. And if I were to do so, he would face a sentence that would be well below the 240 months that Mr. Young received. And so for that reason, I will grant Mr. Young's motion. Judge Jackson, before you granted this fentanyl kingpin's motion to reduce his sentence, did you contact any of the victims from his case?
Senator, thank you for allowing me to address Mr. Young's situation.
I asked a simple question. Did you contact the victims in his case or not?
Senator, Mr. Young was not released. His sentence was reduced, and I did not contact the victims in his case because there were no victims. He committed a crime, a drug crime. There were no identifiable victims in his case.
Drug crime is not a victimless crime. 100,000 Americans were killed by overdoses.
Understood, Senator, but there was no one to contact because
you just
there were no
acknowledged, Judge, you just acknowledged that you did not release him. You're right, you didn't release him. He filed a motion for compassionate release. You denied that rightly, but you reduced his sentence. He didn't file a motion to reduce his sentence. He wasn't eligible for a reduced sentence under the First Step Act because it wasn't retroactive towards him. You took a motion for compassionate release to get out of prison and turned it into a motion to reduce a sentence. So he's going to be released 7.5 years earlier, years from now. Last week, Judge, when we talked in our office, you talked about a lot about judicial restraint. Is transforming his motion for compassionate release into a motion to reduce a sentence for this drug trafficking kingpin an example of judicial restraint, Judge?
Yes, Senator, it is, and I will explain how. Mr. Young, as you say, was facing originally a sentence of 20 years in prison, which I imposed. I tried Mr. Young, who went to trial, primarily because he was facing such a long penalty. I looked at the evidence in his case. He was absolutely the kingpin that you're talking about. But the way that our laws work, the 20-year sentence that he received for the amount of heroin that he had was increased based on a sentence that he received, I think it was 10 or 15 years before. He had no criminal history between the old sentence. Forgive me, I can't remember exactly what it is, and I'm sure people will look it up. But 10, 15 years before, he had some minor sentence. Then he had this really obviously serious, terrible sentence. And the government filed what is called an 851, which is an enhancement based on his really, really old prior criminal history. I followed the law, which said that he had to go to jail for 20 years. It would have been more like 10 years if the government hadn't taken into account his very old criminal history. But I said, fine, this is the law. I'm following it. You're going to jail for 20 years. In the interim, COVID happens. We get lots of compassionate release motions, and there's a statute that Congress has enacted which allows defendants to seek compassionate release, to seek reduction of their sentence, not just release, reduction, release, some adjustment to their penalty under the law if there are extraordinary and compelling reasons to do so. That's the quote from the statute, extraordinary and compelling reasons. It doesn't say anything more narrow than that, although you do have to look at the guidelines related to compassionate release, all of which I did related to his motion. And he argued several things. He argued his smoking, his asthma. These were reasons, he said, for compassionate release, and I disagreed. What I did find extraordinary and compelling is the fact that between the 20-year sentence that I gave him originally and the compassionate release motion that he filed, Congress changed the law. Congress decided that the old penalty, the old crime, was no longer eligible for the increased, so that a person who was convicted at the time of his compassionate release motion for doing exactly what Mr. Young had done would not get a 20-year sentence. That would not be lawful for a person at that moment. And one of the things that Congress says to the judges is care about unwarranted sentencing disparity. Care about the fact that the person you're sentencing is being treated differently than someone else who committed exactly the same crime. And I understand it wasn't retroactive in the sense that everybody, absent a compassionate release motion, wouldn't have been eligible for resentencing. But here I have a defendant before me and all of the factors that Congress has asked me to take into account, and a compelling argument that there were extraordinary and compelling circumstances, that is, a change in the law that would create unwarranted sentencing disparity if I didn't take account of it. And so what I determined under those circumstances is that I would resentence Mr. Young to the penalty that Congress had decided was the appropriate penalty for the conduct that he committed as of the time of his motion.
Judge, Congress did change the law after his sentencing in the First Step Act. That was a terrible mistake. Congress specifically did not make that change retroactively. And you saw that, and you thought it was extraordinary and compelling, even though Congress specifically did not make it retroactive. You chose to rewrite the law because you were sympathetic to a fentanyl drug kingpin whom you had expressed frustration at having sentenced him to his 20-year sentence in the first place. You twisted the law and you rewrote it so you could cut the sentence of a drug kingpin. That's what you did, Judge.
Respectfully, Senator, I disagree. Congress provided judges through the compassionate release motion mechanism with the opportunity to review sentences. Congress, prior to the compassionate release mechanism being enacted, a judge who imposed a sentence would have no opportunity to revisit. In Mr. Young's case, the question was, with this compassionate release motion, under a circumstance in which Congress had changed the law, was that an extraordinary and compelling circumstance to revisit his sentence? And I made a determination that it was.
So I suppose then, if you're confirmed, we can just count on you to always rule in favor of retroactivity, no matter what the facts of the case are, because it was a blatant rewrite of the law here, so you could reduce the sentence of a drug kingpin if you didn't like sentencing to 20 years in the first place.
No, Senator, it was not.
Senator Booker.
For Sunday Morning Futures, I'm Maria Bartiromo. Today, let down in Ukraine, President Zelensky's aides say he is disappointed by the inaction of NATO after an emergency meeting does not yield air cover for Ukraine, and Russia's war on Ukraine enters a second month. Coming up, the two brothers fighting until the bitter end, live with the mayor of Kyiv and his brother leading the troops. Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko will join me live in moments as Russian forces inch closer to the capital of Ukraine. Then the call to end Vladimir Putin's bloodshed heard round the world.
This man cannot remain powerful.
But the White House tries to clean up Biden's rhetoric, saying he did not mean what he said. He is not calling for regime change, and the Kremlin responds this morning. What did the president mean, and how did it get into his speech in the first place? Coming up, Florida Congressman Michael Waltz on the foreign policy that keeps on disappointing. Then Florida Senator Marco Rubio on the China threat, responding to China's support of Russia. Plus, who is in charge, and what is the point? The White House keeps contradicting the president.
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter.
The president believes that sanctions are intended to deter.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence.
Coming up, the latest out of the war, plus show me your budget to show me your values. President Biden is going to be releasing next year's budget tomorrow morning. Will it show his values or those of the progressive left? Wyoming Senator John Barrasso on the left's new idea of sending out checks to anybody.
Issue before this Senate, the legal issue before this Senate, is whether a president has the authority to investigate corruption. So the House managers built their entire case on the proposition that investigating Burisma corruption, investigating the Bidens for corruption, was baseless and a sham. Hold on, let me finish this. No, I'm going to finish my point, and then I'm happy to answer your question. The House managers based their entire case on the proposition that investigating corruption for Burisma and concerning the Bidens was baseless and a sham. That proposition is absurd. We've just seen, they said there wasn't a shred of evidence concerning corruption. We've just seen 2 hours of evidence. And at a minimum, it was not only reasonable and justified, but the president, I think, had an obligation to investigate corruption that potentially extended to the very highest levels of government.
Senator, over those 2 hours, none of the president's attorneys mentioned one single possible crime that Hunter or Joe Biden are accused of. Basically, what they said was Hunter Biden got a job. That was vice president. If that's a crime, I mean, shouldn't half of your children be in prison?
My children are 9 and 11. I'm sorry that you want to throw a 9-year-old in prison, but at this point, my third grader plays basketball and softball at her school. So stop playing the nasty. Stop playing the nasty Washington game.
I'm sorry, that's not nasty Washington game.
Attacking a 9-year-old.
Senator, I have no idea.
Senator, we've seen reports about a possible 1-for-1, one Republican witness, one Democratic witness. Would you be open to that idea?
Look, in my view, additional witnesses are not necessary. The House managers have presented their case. They haven't come remotely close to meeting their burden of proof. Now, that being said, if the Senate later this week, when we vote on witnesses, decides to go down the road to additional witnesses, I think at a minimum, the most important witness for the Senate to hear from is now Hunter Biden. The House manager made a decision. Let another reporter have a chance.
Why don't you want to hear from John Bolton under oath?
I don't believe the testimony is necessary. The House managers have a burden of proof to prove their case. They have fallen woefully short. The standard under the Constitution is high crimes and misdemeanors. They have not demonstrated any law was violated. And the president was entirely justified in asking for an investigation.
Obviously, don't worry, he'll. Ukraine, and we are getting more data about the toll it has taken on the Ukrainian people. Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General saying that 136 children have been killed since the war began. This is after the United Nations declared that more than 1,000 civilians have died in the months since Putin's aggression started. President Biden is expected to give a major address in Poland today as he tries to drum up global support for the Ukrainian people. We're going to take you there live for the latest. But earlier this morning, Ukraine's foreign minister said that no other country provided Ukraine with more support than the United States. Ukraine's capital is under another extended curfew. Reports out of that only vehicles with special permits are going to be allowed to drive on the streets of Kyiv from now until 7 a.m. local time on March 28th. Residents are being told they can only leave their homes to go to a shelter. We have live reports on the ground and stateside throughout the day. But first, let's go check in with Michael Grimm on the ground in Kyiv, Ukraine right now. Michael, what's the latest from there?
Good morning, Carl. I'm about 12 kilometers or so outside of the center of Kyiv in a residential area known as Vinogradar. What's important to note is that there is, as you mentioned about deaths of children, you can't see it in my frame, but hopefully you have the footage.
Michael, I think we lost you there for a second. We're gonna try to get you back, but hopefully everything is well over there. You know, we never lost the signal, so we appreciate your reporting. Stay safe. All right, folks, joining me now with the analysis of the situation on the ground is former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and NATO Allied Command Operations, retired 4-star General Philip Breedlove. General, welcome to America Right Now.
Good morning. How are you doing, Carl?
Quite well, sir. The UK Defense Ministry said that Russia prefers, quote, indiscriminate bombardments and will likely continue to use heavy firepower on urban areas. What does this tell us about both their tactics and their capabilities going forward in this conflict?
Well, what they've been unable to do is meet the Ukrainian forces in decisive battle because Ukraine has a much smarter game plan, and they are fighting a skirmishing rear attack sort of expected.
Right. Well, talk to us about the effectiveness and the significance of the fact that this was thought to be a 3, 4, 5-day war by many people, myself probably included in that bunch. And now the Ukrainians are actually taking back ground. What's the significance of that in this conflict?
Well, it's a big deal because we hope that at some point we can come to some sort of resolution, and that it will be a negotiated resolution, because these two armies could fight each other for months and months and months if we're trying to get to an absolute defeat. Mm-hmm. So going into any negotiation, an army wants to have a good position on the ground, and what's happening now is Ukraine is improving its position every day, and their power at the negotiation table is going up.
Yeah, General, President Zelensky right now is claiming that they've killed 16,000 Russian troops. Russian numbers vary. Conservative estimates in the media are 4,000 to 7,000. I mean, this is since the beginning of the conflict. Keep in mind, General, we lost, I'm a veteran of the Iraq War, and also have many friends who even passed away in Afghanistan. We only lost 3,000 troops in the entire 20-year conflict. We're a month in. What does that mean?
It's staggering, frankly. I think the more realistic numbers are around 12,000 Russians lost. And frankly, what you reported just a few minutes ago on this station, or your previous folks did, of the numbers of Ukrainian civilians killed, I think that number is going to go farther up once we really see what's going on the ground. We don't have people in all the places where the shelling, the indiscriminate murder of Ukrainian citizens that's been going on.
Right.
That number will go up as well.
And General, we haven't seen warfare like this since World War II, realistically. I mean, keep in mind, even going back to Vietnam, we were fighting primarily in the jungles, not in cities and urban areas. But in Iraq, we didn't bomb the cities unless we had a strategic target. I know I was a JTAC. I called in airstrikes on a variety of different targets. And in cities, the biggest I could use was an HC-130, which is a very direct munition that wouldn't take out and have a lot of collateral damage. We are seeing over the horizon things like artillery shells, hypersonic missiles taking out schools, theaters, other infrastructure. I mean, what's the end in sight if they're willing to just indiscriminately destroy things?
Carl, I am and was a JTAC as well. And you and I what we're seeing is just shelling with absolutely no aim. You and I had to worry about collateral damage estimates and impact, et cetera, and Russia has thrown that out. And sadly, we have seen that. Grozny, eastern Syria, when Russia is unable to meet military force and fight military force, they take the fight to the civilians, and that's what we're seeing right now. Ukraine is frustrating them, and so they are now fighting the civilian population of Ukraine.
Yeah, and General, we had Ukrainian Councilwoman Kira Ludik on Wake of America yesterday. I was in for Rob Finnerty, and she had a stark warning for President Biden that basically said, if you don't stop him in Ukraine, you're going to have to stop him in Poland. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I would amend a little bit. My fear is that next would be either Georgia or Moldova, because we've drawn this bright line around NATO, and part of drawing a bright line around NATO sort of signals to Mr. Putin that anybody outside of NATO is fair game. And so I worry more about Moldova and Georgia next. But you are correct. If we do not address this now, we will see it in the future.
Yeah. So I got to ask about this civilian armed, let's call it a militia. That's basically what it is. Putin has drastically underestimated the ability and the will to fight of these Ukrainian people. We know that in urban combat, an advancing force is effective against a hunkered down home field advantage force like somebody shooting from their window. 5 to 1 is about the estimates. Can Putin continue to sustain these losses, and is there any end in sight? Is it no wonder that he's moved on from taking downtown Kyiv?
I do not think he can continue to sustain these losses. And you started to see today and yesterday, actually in Russian press, some open challenge to Mr. Putin by some of those who are reporting.
They always do. As lawmakers in California, Connecticut, and Illinois now introduce a bill to give out what would amount to $300 a month stimulus checks if gas is above $4 a gallon. Right now, the national average is about 25 cents higher than that. But it's even worse in California, where drivers are paying more than $6 a gallon. Think about that. So Governor Newsom wants to give car owners